about your background a little bit, what I know of it. And so, and also you're a poet. You read widely. You're interested in literature. You're one of the authors that I think has had some influence over you is Wendell Berry, or some of his ideas. Wendell Berry is very interested and concerned about connection to place, connection to the land. So I think that you have some of those same feelings. The first time I heard the expression sense of place was from you. And I digested that, and it seemed to me to be important, and something that then I spent time thinking about. But anyway, so that's things that I know about as background for your deciding to write a novel. So would you add anything to your background that's?
Yeah, I would. I think that as you say, that my growing up on a cattle ranch in North Idaho, my father was a logger. That shaped my views of things. It also gave me kind of a firsthand seat to see what logging does to the landscape. And my father was a small-time Jippo logger, not part of a big corporation, and they didn't clear cut trees then. I also saw the attitudes of naturalists of all sorts growing up, going into 4-H. I did 4-H for many years and FFA all through high school. So I was engaged in the agricultural community. But my grandfather fled the Dust Bowl, and that's how the family wound up where we were. So I see my interest in history sends me looking causes in the past to effects that we are experiencing now. And I see the Dust Bowl as one of the more recent examples of human negative influence on the climate, on their own landscape, on their own lives, a self-destructive process.
Okay, all right, that's really good. That's important.
I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, have you read Susan Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, or Searching for the Mother Tree? She grew up in a family of loggers in British Columbia. And then it's about she came to understand how forests work, and the ways trees are connected together, especially. You might, if you haven't read that, I think you'd.
Yeah, I think I have read excerpts of it. I don't believe I read the whole thing, yeah. But it's that's part of my thinking in that regard. That growing up in North Idaho was even as a small child, I realized, listening to the stories of my grandfather and the people who had been there before he and brought his family there in the late 30s. It was a degraded environment. I was born into a degraded environment. We all were, and some places more so than others. And I grieved that there was a personal loss to wander among these giant cedar stumps as a child, and they were 12 feet tall, and some of them were 12, 15 feet across. I played in these hollow stumps because they had been burned. So what the logging company would log these trees in the wintertime, skid these huge trees out because cedar was valuable. They skid these trees out on the snow, and they would burn the slash in the spring. And they set whole hillsides on fire. And then they put those properties that they owned up for sale as stump farms. So my grandfather bought a stump farm from a flyer. He literally saw a flyer on a post somewhere that said well-watered stump farms, North Idaho, you know. So that's how we wound up in that place. But I grew up feeling that sense of loss of an intact ecosystem. I could see, even as a little person, that it was an impoverished ecosystem compared to what it had once been.
So I wonder also if uh, you saw an impoverished ecosystem, but your family didn't go to the city.
Right.
Your family stayed out in the country, and also were interested in trying to live some sort of a self-sufficient life versus, coming into the city and being part of an urban manufacturing culture, whatever. So that's right. And so that's part of your value system, I think, as well. It's to be independent. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I agree. I do think that there are people who were driven off the land by ecological problems during the Dust Bowl, and that there were people who fled to the cities for wage labor. I think that my grandparents, for whatever reason, excuse me, that didn't appeal to them. That they saw that that people in the cities starving and standing in bread lines, and they and country people. My grandparents weren't wheat farmers in the western part of Kansas. They had a more diversified farms and a feed store and raised eggs, and in eastern Kansas near Topeka. And the so it wasn't as bad there, but the economic collapse hit them equally hard. So they didn't have as much of the investment in the wheat that was just, in all that plowing, but they were connected to it economically and then eventually ecologically. And they saw that the effects of that hit people in the cities disproportionately hard. And you could always eat if you have a garden. And if you have rain, you can have a garden. But the Dust Bowl produced a situation where there was neither money nor rain. So that's and that's a key part, actually, going forward. It's climate change is devastating on many levels, many of which are quite subtle, and cascade forward. An example might be the sea star wasting disease in the Pacific Northwest coast. That sea star wasting disease caused sea stars to not be around to eat urchins. Urchins
Right.
eat kelp holdfasts.
Right.
Kelp holdfasts no longer can survive long enough for the kelp to mature in the season, which changes the whole dynamic. They're like the trees of a forest, and they're all gone. So all of those species that are dependent on the kelp forests, and even the currents that it changes, the wave action on the shoreline, even the physical effects of it in that manner are cascading forward from a virus that affected a little starfish.
Right. Well,
So
so for some time now, I don't know, you've been working on your novel for a year, maybe?
yeah.
So how did you decide you wanted to write a novel? And then, well, let's start with that question. What got you going? It's a lot of work. And
Well, I have always, I love stories. I always have. I was a voracious reader as a child, and the worlds that I experienced in reading were so much
hang on one
more.
second. Hang on one second. we're taking care of Jenny and Juan Carlos's cat. And I don't know if you could hear her in the background.
I
And
did.
she's complaining about something, and she's got two of her little toys. And she was making a lot of noise, and I guess she wants somebody to play with her. I don't know, but I'm not gonna do it. So,
All right, so we have a cat soundtrack in the background. That's
yeah,
great.
right. So anyway, we were talking about your writing, so, and I interrupted you, so we'll get back to that.
Well, as a child, I thought I would be a novelist. I thought I would write stories. That was what I saw myself doing. And partially, I think it was what I knew and what I loved. And I knew I didn't want to be a logger. I knew I didn't want to be a businessman or a dentist or I all of these options that were out there. They had personal impacts, but that their larger impacts were more muted and probably from a sense of ego or a sense of wanting to be a hero. I wanted to help things. I wanted to make things better. I wanted to change people's minds. I wanted to motivate people. I'm not very, I'm not a charismatic speaker. I wouldn't make a very good politician, I suspect. I probably wouldn't make a very good preacher unless it was the Church of Ecology. And I felt like that I was moved and motivated by fiction to a large extent, that I found that stories are motivating and memorable in a way that facts and nonfiction tend not to be. I mean, there are some wonderful nonfiction out there. Don't get me wrong. There's wonderful writers out there, but I find that stories are more compelling. The examples might be something like Old Testament stories. You know, children remember the story of Noah, right? Or they remember the story of Moses and the tablets, or Moses in the rushes. You know, these children's stories that have derived from Old Testament story are much more memorable to most people than lists of history. And I think that throughout time that it's easier to remember the Iliad than it is the Republic, right? So I wanted to participate in that conversation that you started our conversation with, saying that there's a great conversation that goes on through time. And I, at St. John's, where I went to college, the Great Books program there defines it in precisely that, in that term, that there is a great conversation that goes on in our civilization, and you mostly listen, right? It's a one-sided conversation you're having with Plato, but it's nevertheless part of a conversation. And if you haven't read Plato, then you miss parts of later conversations because you just don't know the background. And so
Right.
I think that's part of the reason that history and the longer picture has appealed to me, and why I want to include that in my stories.
Okay, so so you, from an early age, were interested in reading fiction and in thinking yourself potentially as a writer.
Right.
So that's been there a long time. But then for some reason in these COVID times, 2020 maybe or so, you got really turning over in your mind, apparently, really thinking about, gosh, maybe this is an opportunity. This is a time to start this, to get after this.
Right.
So what's the trigger? I mean, you've been there, been thinking about it a long time, and now you did it.
Well, life intervenes, as it frequently does. And I was told, like most young aspiring writers, that there's no money in writing, that you need to go get, if you want to be involved with words, you need to be an English teacher or a professor. Neither of which appealed to me. I don't work well in large groups, bureaucracies frustrate me. And I had wonderful teachers in my education, but they were successful largely despite the administration and the bureaucracy rather than because of it. And I didn't want to participate in that. And life, as I said, intervened. I had children very young and had all sorts of jobs in my life. I've been a heavy equipment operator and a scuba instructor and a carpenter and a realtor and you name it. I've done a lot of different things. I scooped ice cream in college, you know. So I've had a lot of experience across a variety of work fields, and I didn't want to be um, I didn't want to do something that compromised my values and what I'm trying to accomplish in that. And I needed to eat and feed my family. And so those kinds of economic concerns kept me from having the time to write. And I also realized early on that in your 20s, now maybe Melville accepted, but generally in your 20s, it's rare for someone to have the experience to have something worth saying. Um, and there's plenty of books in the world. Why add to them if you don't have something unique and interesting to say? So some of what compelled me to write at the time that I began writing this novel was simply that I have the time, and I suddenly realized that I now have something to say.
All right, that's great. That's a good answer. So, so did you have a general sense of having something to say and it being an opportune time? Or did an idea, a story come to you in a dream or who knows that you felt compelled to tell? Or neither?
Well, it was actually triggered by a website that is called um, God, now I'm going to blank on the name of it. It's basically a website that allows you. It's a global map that's publicly sourced data, and with that map you're able to change the sea level and zoom in on a map. And so um, I had always been fascinated by change. In my period, the time in the desert, you know, we found seashells on the tops of hills, um, you know, fossilized shells. And I've always been fascinated by paleo history in North America. And, you know, there's a lot of new information about how North America was populated and when by early Paleo Indians. And that the fact that the sea level, which is such a defining factor along the coast, could change so dramatically in not recorded history, but remembered history, that the Dogger Banks off the northern portion of the British Isles, you know, it was solid ground. You could walk, you know, halfway to Iceland chasing reindeer at one point there. And these were our ancestors, and it wasn't that long ago. On the Pacific coast, this, as you know, the Pacific coast is extremely steep and very deep right offshore. You can be, there are places where a couple of 100 feet offshore, you're a couple of 100 feet deep. So it's not as dramatic a horizontal change as it would be on a place like the East Coast, where these long flat banks out to the edge of the continental shelf. On this coast, I suspect because of the subduction of the Pacific plates and the Juan de Fuca plate beneath the continental plate, that we have this abrupt edge. So the change those in that historic and prehistoric periods was not as dramatic here, but I've always been fascinated by that. Who knows what's buried under the silt along the shoreline, because people live and travel along the shoreline. So
No.
that fascination, let me finish this, that fascination led me to this map, and I started playing with this map to see how things would change. I live on an island, so the coast is very present and immediate to me. And I wanted to see, well, what happens to my island when, if sea level goes up 15 feet? What happens if it goes up 60 feet? What happens if it went up 400 feet? You know, what did it look like when it was 400 feet lower? You know, so that got me excited about setting a story in this region.
So you were able to look at a map of the world, project different levels of sea levels, and which happened in the past, might happen in the future.
Right.
And as you say, living on an island, you're really sensitive to the sea, and you see that with the tides every day. And so, and also having a sense of what's going on with climate change, and it's going to affect sea level. It already is. And then having in the back of your mind, always wanting to tell a story and always write, then that you're saying that triggered that was a palpable experience of the drama of climate change and what could be coming. And then that gets you thinking about, well, what, Seattle's going to be underwater or whatever, how is this going to affect people? What are they
Right.
going to do? Okay. So what happened after that?
Well, that sea level change map allowed me to project forward, taking a look at current climate change information, and particularly about information from the glaciologists and polar ice specialists in relation to Greenland and West Antarctica, that coming out of that, which I've been following for 20 plus years now, trying to stay current on the thinking that's happening there. And I've seen transformation happening within the scientific community. 20 years ago, there was much less sense of I don't know if panic is the right word. I mean, we're talking about the timescales we're discussing, but there's certainly a sense of doom among the scientists that I'm familiar with. That the climate change scientists and the people who are studying polar ice are really, really concerned.
So
And
you have
that.
so anyway, I was going to say, so you have a context,
Right.
and so then, but then you need, you have characters, you have story. Where does
Right.
where does that come from, and how did you start writing? Did you sketch
Okay.
something out, or?
Yeah, so I started with the place. I started with a map. One of my favorite authors, Ursula Le Guin, talks about starting with maps, and I've always loved maps. I think of the world, or I vision the world from a bird's eye point of view, from that sort of aerial, looking at the landscape from above and encompassing the whole thing. And it frustrates my wife because she's like, "Well, you're lost," and I'm like, "No, I don't know exactly where I am, but I know where I'm going, and I know the general direction, and I'll get there eventually because I have the overview." So the map at the beginning of the novel gives me the overview. The details, when you narrow down, then I get to, oh, who lives here? What's interesting? What's happening to their lives? How are their lives shaped? And part of what I have been offended by with the, which I call the, I don't know if you're allowed to say this, but the McDonaldization, essentially, McWorld of culture around the world, that I feel like the American empire, an economic empire and economic method that spread around the world, metastasized around the world by some phrasing, has taken a homogenized culture, a very shallow and pathetic culture, sort of the opposite of a sense of place. And that, I find that appalling that people are growing up, the young people are growing up in this homogenized world. Atlanta looks like Denver, which looks like Glendale, and in that everything is homogenized and all to an extremely really kind of the lowest common denominator. So that made me think, well, what is better? What's more important? What does Wendell Berry have to say that makes him interesting about that one little community on the river in Kentucky? You know, what does Ursula Le Guin have to say about these imaginary worlds that she conceived? It's the specifics and the details of people's lives. And so I found a character that I resonated with, a young apprentice, a boat builder's apprentice. And I said, what happens to this boat builder apprentice? What is his life like? How are their communities structured? So that's how I began, was with a single character.
Okay. So then, so you have a single character, you have a place, you have a set of conditions. And so this is set 500 years in the future, or?
Yes, yes, exactly.
And then with an expectation that the sea level is going to be?
Well, I have probably exaggerated the sea level rise. I don't actually think the science, as we know it at the moment, supports as much sea level rise and as much melt as I have projected into a 500-year. It may be thousands and thousands of years. It may turn around. There are some plausible, if not, well, let's say plausible. There are plausible ideas that destabilization of the climate could flip us back into a glacial period from this current interglacial. I mean, we're still in a glacial period. There's ice on the planet. And that's why the name of this series is Ice-Free Earth, because I want to talk about the end of ice and how that affects human cultures and civilizations around the world, and explore those through the eyes of these characters that have their own personal stories to make them compelling. I mean, we need a story to remember. We need a story that we can relate to in order to remember this information. So I want to tell a good story first and foremost, but I also want to illustrate these ideas. And I think that that's what all good hard science fiction has always aspired to explore ideas via story.
So you said series, is it called Ice-Free Earth, or?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the working title for the series is Ice-Free Earth. It's a bit, I couldn't think of anything better, so that's what I ran with. And I was more engaged in this writing the story than worrying about the title for the
Sure.
series. But so it's kind of become that now. But if you have a better suggestion, I would be open to that.
I don't know. That's great. So you're describing, you've got a character, you've got a set of characters, you have a place which is northwest. You've got a sea level, and you've got a young man who's a boat builder apprentice, and then all other characters. So you're presupposing that human civilization hasn't ended. It's
Correct.
different.
Correct. Very different.
Yeah, right. And we'll get to that in a second. So there are scenarios that suggest that everything will collapse and maybe the world will be left to the beasts, and good for them, and good riddance to human beings, maybe. But there are other authors, and one that you're a bit familiar with, Octavia Butler, has a sense of what would happen in Southern California as society and government slowly collapsed. That it, wasn't like a thermonuclear war, it was just things stopped working. So was that your sense of the world? It's still working in some way, that it's different.
As I see parallels with um, the latter couple of centuries of the Roman Empire, and I see parallels with other cultures that have salinated their soils or experienced droughts, things beyond their control. The Anasazi, the ancient Hopi people, the ancient Pueblo people of the American Southwest, um, faced a devastating drought that came upon them and forced them to abandon these incredible structures and lifeways, and change dramatically, also accompanied by new people coming into the region. And if you think about that in terms of our own culture, it's like there are parallels. We don't have control. We don't know what's happening with the climate. We know it's changing. We know things. It was 106 on my porch last summer on Orcas Island. That's pretty stunning. In 32 years, it's never been over, the low 90s. And last summer it was 106. So that kind of thing gets your attention. So I'm looking at humans' survival as more like, I think that it's tempting to look at climate change in an apocalyptic manner. It's tempting to deny that and say, no, we'll have a technological nirvana. We'll think our way out of this one like we have so many times. There'll be something new will come along. We just need this new energy source to continue. My own feeling is that we get neither apocalypse or the singularity, that we get kind of a muddling along, and that our basic problem is there's too many human beings. And we could live a decent life on this planet and with a very high level of technology, but only with far fewer people. There simply isn't the energetic sources for us to live in harmony with the environment with this many people. And that doesn't mean we need a plague, although we're on the tail end of a minor one, or devastating collapse. All we need is to reduce our birth rate below our death rate to a couple of points. It said, and I haven't done the math myself, but people I trust have, and a 3% death rate over the birth rate will result in 100 years with 5% of the original population. And that can be humans, it could be lemurs, it could be bacteria in a petri dish, but a 3% over the birth rate over 100 years. And that's not that painful. That's not that devastating. That's a few more of us old guys, maybe kicking off because of cancer, kicking off because of something a little earlier than we might, a few more children who don't make it because of poor nutrition. Those kinds of minor changes in demographics over a few hundred years can make a dramatic difference in the human population and thus the human impact on the planet. So I think that things are going to get hard in the near term. And by that, I mean the next couple of centuries. But then after that, I think things will stabilize because humans are adaptable. We'll figure something out. It might not be pretty. It might not be joyous as in the ways that it could if we had done better planning. But I think that it is eminently survivable. The human race is in no danger of extinction.
So do you want to, so you have your characters, you've put them in motion. What's the name of the place that they're occupying?
It's called Olympic Island. If you raise, I raised the sea level 50 meters on this map, 165 feet, and that allows, you're familiar with the topography of the Olympic Peninsula.
Sure.
So the river, the Chehalis River, runs at the southern base of the mountains from the coast out by Aberdeen up all the way to Olympia. Are you okay, John?
Yeah, I'm looking at a map of Washington right now.
Okay.
I have a huge
So
map of Washington, and I,
yeah, this is it actually one of your favorite walks when you lived in down by
right,
Olympia
yeah.
was along that very place that I flooded in my story.
So interestingly, I look at this map and it colors altitude, the different altitudes have different colors. And
Okay,
so there's a dark green spot that goes, as you say, from Olympia. I'm just looking at it, that it goes all the way south and then turns west and goes out to Grays Harbor.
exactly,
And
exactly.
so that becomes, and so the Olympic Peninsula becomes an island. Is that what's
Yes.
happening?
And
Okay,
that's the location of my story. That's where Kai lives on one of these long sounds that reach up. If you flood that peninsula to 165 feet over current sea levels, there are lots of long sounds and that reach up into the peninsula,
right,
now an island. And it makes for interesting tides. It makes for a maritime climate. And um, based on my understanding and projections of current climate going forward, I'm projecting a climate similar to Central and Northern California in this region 500 years from now. So where the fog line reaches, I have redwood trees, mature redwood trees in this region. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities by playing with the topography like that. And just as Wendell Berry implies, and as Wes Jackson from Kansas, as he talks about a sense of place. If you haven't read Becoming Native to Your Place, or Becoming Native to Our Place by Wes Jackson, it's a wonderful description of what he means by his sense of place, and that becoming native, it's not just learning the names of the plants and the trees, it's shape culture to the climate and to the ecological necessities. Um, so
okay, so you have a big island, Olympic Island. It's got mountains and it's got fjords,
yeah,
and it's separated from the mainland by these fjords and
fast
wider,
flowing water,
yeah,
yes.
wider waterways than there are today. So
Right.
you got the characters. So what is it? What are you doing with the characters? So you're telling a story. So do you have what? And maybe there are multiple stories, but how are those stories? How are they different, or are they different from today's stories? How are their lives different, and are they admirable? Are they learning things? How do they cope? Have they, is what civilization is there? Does it have different values? Is it more egalitarian? Is it more democratic? Are there now kings and princes, or what's that world like?
Well, the reason that I have structured this larger story as a series is because I see um, that when people are geographically isolated, even when it comes to a valley, there are places in the Caucasus today that they speak unintelligible languages in the next valley, literally over into the next drainage, because they're essentially impassable mountains. It's so rugged, and there's so little reason to go over a mountain for any reason when you can go down the natural drainage and up the natural drainage. So even though they're proximate in space, they're not proximate culturally. Their languages are literally unintelligible to one another. So that kind of diversity is what I see coming out of this the great reduction in human population and the isolation of these small communities allows for much greater diversity and variability in the cultural groups that form. And so the series is intending to explore a variety of those. One story I'm working on at the moment, the Book of Kai, and that's the name of the main characters, Kai. The Book of Kai is the story of these maritime, forest dwelling, redwood living people in this quite benign climate at that time. It's they get sufficient rain, and places on the planet at that time don't. But they live in a fairly mild place, and it's my view that as Churchill said, we shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us. And I would say that extrapolating that a little bit larger, that your landscape shapes us as well. And so these are they're kindly people, and they have some guidance from, and this is one of the big ideas in the story. The ice is obviously the melting of the ice. That's climate change. But one of the ideas I'm putting forward is that I want to explore and feel how that would feel from the inside, from a personal point of view, is inspired by the monasteries' traditions of preserving knowledge from earlier times. And so I have essentially a group of monks who are preserving what they were able to salvage over generations of the previous cultures, archaic industrial cultures, knowledge base and ways in literature. It's like, what can we save from this? You mentioned in an email to me, what do you hope to accomplish? And maybe we'll get to this later, but one of the things I want is to get people thinking about what's worth saving. You know, are chicken McNuggets worth saving for a future culture? Not to me, you know. So other people may feel differently, but understanding immunization, understanding vaccination, understanding the role of sanitation, all of those things are worthwhile saving, even just the principle of the scientific method and rationality. The concept of zero, you know, all of these things, we had civilizations and cultures didn't have any of those things, and they would have been better if they had. So saving these ideas. So there's some guiding force from these librarian monks, and so they give guidance to this region from their little enclave.
So one of the concerns, focuses of the response to climate change today, one could call search for climate justice. And so there are all kinds of ways that human beings now live in ways that some groups are favored, some groups have a lot, and some groups are not favored and do poorly. And those can be within a culture, within the United States. They can be between the global North and the global South. And so one of the concerns, if we are in fact in a huge, extremely important conversation, is what's the right way to deal with this, react to it. And so one orientation is we just need lots of technology. And if we could sequester carbon, if we could, have more sources of clean energy, whatever, everything would be fine if we could just have, the problem is technological, or maybe a little bit political. But there's another point of view, which is that it's not even primarily technological. It has to do with institutions. It has to do with value systems. It has to do with out of control capitalism versus, whatever. so that in order for, well, so one opportunity of these times is to improve or question or move forward agendas of justice and change in society, maybe just as much as technology or instead of technology or something, that those values are extremely important. And so does that, those sorts of concerns show up in your Olympic Island?
They do, absolutely. And part of what I was talking about with these librarian monks are that I call them stewards in my story. And there's a backstory to that. But the essence of I don't personally think that our problem is insufficient technology. I think our problem is that it's not that we haven't been clever enough yet. It's that we have poor long-term planning skills. In fact, we essentially have no long-term planning skills. That short-sightedness, I think, is what's killing us. You're froze up on me there, John. Are you okay? All right. Yeah. Maybe you were just super still. It looked like the screen
Yeah,
froze.
no, I wasn't, but, so let me ask you about that. So one could say that we have all sorts of ways to look into the future and model the future, whether it's weather or selling gadget, all sorts of gizmos and so forth, so we can do that. What we lack is, we could say character or virtues or an ability to say no, or an ability to, one thing that Oswald Spengler's view of Western society, he called it Faustian.
Yes.
And so Faustian is about more. And I, so I mean, that's one way of looking at what world cultures become. But that hasn't been the case necessarily in the past. There are groups that have been traditional groups that don't think more is the right way to live. So
I agree. I agree completely with that, John. There's, and I look at cultures that have survived for extended periods. I'm thinking in particular of some of the Australian Aboriginal groups in the North in particular, that these are people that have lived in the same place through dramatic climate changes for at least 65,000 years. Their handprints on the ceiling, 65,000 years old in some of these rock shelters. And so we know that these people are there and that they've lived there for all that time. So what did they do? How did they live? Their stories have to teach us about how we might do better or even survive culturally. Frankly, I don't think our culture will survive. I think our culture is headed for the great compost heap of history. But I think that the emergent cultures that come out of the chaos at the tail end can be much more hopeful. And that one of the critical things that I see historically in cultures that survive is they say no. They're self-limiting. And in many ways, those self-limitations are woven into the fabric of a culture. And one of the limitations that all groups make is controlling how many children they have. There's only so many children. If you have too many children, that's more than the land can support. So the carrying capacity of your climate dictates how many people can live there. And if you're hunting and gathering, that's a very immediate concern. In our culture, we have all kinds of ways of getting around that basic relationship to our environment. We ship apples from Chile to a place that grows apples so that we can have them out of season. And it's absurd. It's an absurd waste. So there's also, in the traditional cultures that survive, there's very little waste and there's self-limitation. So one of the key things in my story, coming from the stewards, is a guide that they call the Book of Limitations. And the Book of Limitations is my reaction to technology that that we look at. And at the moment, anything we can do, we try, and somebody charges ahead with it. And we want to try to, after the fact, we want to try to regulate it or whatever. But we never stop to say, yes, we can, but should we? You know, the precautionary principle is utterly lacking in most of the scientific disciplines that I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
Because we can doesn't mean we should.
So where are you? So well, let's see. So where are you in your writing process? And do you expect, have you written the first volume have you written the Book of Kai, or?
Yes, I have a first draft of the Book of Kai. It's in revision right now, and I have been doing a lot of sketching out of how the story interconnects with other. I'm going back into the story and refining things that I wrote. My writing style tends to be, I get kind of a rough outline figured out, and then I kind of jump in and see what happens. And I bonk some characters up against one another. I put somebody in some sort of trouble and see what happens. And so it evolves at that level of the story. At the larger level of the story, there's got to be connections between later events. So I'll go back and revise to foreshadow some later events that when I was writing that piece initially, I didn't know that was going to happen later. But now that I do know what happens later, I can go back and foreshadow something, or if there's something that conflicts, that I made a character doing one thing that doesn't really jibe with where he winds up, I can go back and change that. And so that's the stage I'm in right now, is I'm doing those kind of structural revisions.
Do you expect to write a series and then seek publication, or do you intend to outline a series but try to publish the first volume, or do you intend to go right to Netflix to see if they'll pick it up and write a screenplay, or what?
Yeah, I suspect that being a mature novelist writer, that unless it's possible that I luck into an award or some sort of larger recognition somewhere, what I'm anticipating, barring those sort of happy accidents, would be to self-publish the initial volume, to work on subsequent volumes in the series, and depending on the success of the first book, and what I would like to do would be to travel, drive around the country, delivering my books to independent bookstores and doing little talks, kind of like what we're having about, well, what motivated me to write this book about this particular time in the future, and why do I think it looks that way, to get people thinking and talking. I mean, I would come and talk to your book club if you were reading my novel and say, yeah, let's talk about the Book of Limitations. You know, why have I put these people in the Bronze Age? You know, it's like, why do they not use They have the knowledge to do iron metallurgy, but they choose not to. And why is that? And so those kinds of things are what I see going forward. Ultimately, of course, I'd love to, a couple of the volumes written, I would love for it to be picked up and made available to a larger audience. I would really love to get, instead of preaching to the choir, I would love to have my stories exposed to a larger audience that's maybe not thinking along these lines. You know, if there are housewives in Des Moines who, you know, they want their petunias all in a row and their lawn mowed just so, and their neighbors to think well of them, and that's all lovely and important to their sense of well-being. But I sometimes think that suburban point of view, where you're neither urbanized and living in the kind of unavoidable chaos of a city, and you're also not in the the natural structure of rural areas, that you only visit those places, that when your life is in this artificial suburban life, it's neither here nor there. And I think that people in those which most of us live in those kinds of places, that that it's harder to see both ends of the spectrum. And so you tend to fear what you don't know. And I think a story that makes what you're afraid of more palatable, or at least more understandable, or even not scary, in the sense that, oh, I want my story to have a happy ending. I'm not writing a drama, you know, it's or a tragedy. I mean, I'm not writing tragedy. I'm writing drama. And the what I want is for people to be moved and motivated by my story.
So one experience of writing a novel I've gotten from my son Noah, who's written 3 novels, 1 published. And he talks about the way the characters seem to take over the process, that they begin to have motivations and directions and plans kind of on their own. And then he sort of writes it down, and they more and more come to dictate the process, and he, you know, can barely even force them to do whatever. Have you found that your characters become self-directing, or what would you say?
Yeah, I think that that's a way it's frequently described. I think there's a spectrum of the way people write, and that maybe we move as authors along that spectrum, depending on what part of the story we're in, where we are in our writing experiences. That for me, characters are generally, I sketch out characters. I generally have an idea of how old they are, what some of their background is. I don't know their emotional state particularly until I start writing it. I don't know their character as well. I'm actually finding one of the more interesting characters is my antagonist. And he's got an interesting backstory, and he's representative of some awkward and I mean, awkward is not a great word, of some less than positive traits in our current culture. And and so he has some way is kind of representing by some people in this future state. You know, he's not a builder, right? And and so he's actually more interesting in some ways than the good guys. Because the good guys, there's a limit to what they can do.
Yeah, so I'm not, so now you're
guy, he can do anything.
Yeah, right, right. And often Milton's Paradise Lost, that the devil was, or the Paradise Lost was much more interesting than the, than heaven. So uh, what other, what else has surprised you about the writing experience? Has it given you some sense of peace about climate change, for instance? You've created this world, people are in it, they're doing things. And so you already created a space in the future for some people, they're doing okay. Or so what's come out of this for you that you've noticed that's surprising or interesting or confusing?
Well, that's the hopes that um, that even given the days of the previous centuries from where my story is set, and the limitations that the people have, energetic, ecological, and so on. The degraded, some systems are quite degraded still and haven't recovered. Others have recovered. Um, that has given me more hope. I'm more hopeful that there is a positive future uh, for our descendants. There's more freedom available to them to discover what they can do in this world. And also by thinking about where the future might be, it's made me look a lot at the past. And humanity has lived through equally dramatic climate change. Now, we haven't lived through a hothouse Earth scenario, but I don't think it's going to go that far. I certainly hope not. I think that that's a very small percentage chance. I think that more likely extended interglacial period, warming and cooling, dramatic warming and cooling events of 12,000 years ago, that's a very parallel period in some ways. And we got through that. Things changed. We adapted. We became more agriculturalist, and life changed. Humanity will be okay. We'll get through this, no doubt. Um, I'm heartened by the fact that there are places that I know personally that were dramatically different 15,000 years ago. Death Valley was a lake surrounded by pine trees. That all of that Great Basin area were huge estuaries. There's a reason those flight paths for those migration routes for so many birds go through those tule swamps and those lake beds, and because those patterns were built into those birds over millennia, and they still are there in those birds. The climate has changed around them, and the birds aren't adapting as well. Humans can adapt. We can think our way culturally out of the situation we find ourselves in.
So one of your one of the purposes, or you would hope results of your book and people reading it, is that they could also picture a future, a possible future, a reasonably, future that you could expect. You could see how things would work out that way. That's not the end of the world. That's a different world, an evolved world, a smaller world, a world that's changed. And so that in itself is encouraging. One of the things that as I think about the global reserves of coal, oil, and gas, they're not infinite.
Right.
And one thing I read recently is that at the current state of use of coal, we have about 150 years, and oil and gas about 50 years. And so what will happen, whether we plan anything or able to accomplish anything, is in fact fossil fuels, they're going to be gone. They're not going to go on forever. And so then we do know that methane comes out of the atmosphere over a fairly short period of time. Carbon dioxide, it takes longer, but it does come out of the atmosphere. And so, and then carbon dioxide will eventually come out of the oceans and so forth. So it's not, it's going to be a bad time for 200 years or 500 years or a couple thousand years, but it's not going to stay the same. And so,
Right.
so this,
Things tend to
yeah,
restabilize.
yeah,
The
so,
systems
yeah,
will restabilize eventually.
yeah. So this is a time of change and a time of extremes, but but it'll change again in the future, and presumably in a good way, uh, unless we lose the atmosphere or something. But I'm not. The Earth has been hotter than it is now. It's also been much colder than it is now. So there is some short term. It certainly doesn't look very promising, but longer term, uh, who knows what it's going to be? But it's not the end of the planet, and it's
Not
not
at all.
humanity.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's not a planet-ending event. I think that there's this one species of very clever but not wise hominids that have temporarily destabilized things, but mostly we have a much higher opinion of our effect than reality actually supports. I'd like to emphasize that my story it's fiction, but it's not fantasy. It's like I'm making things up that obviously I can't know because it hasn't happened yet, but it's based on the best scientific understanding that I can acquire of that period coming up. So I want people to feel that it's plausible, even if it's not likely, it's still plausible. Whereas I find interstellar space travel to be implausible, not impossible, but implausible given our current understanding of physics.
And your characters do not have superpowers.
They're just people, just like us.
Yeah. All
They
right.
have feuds and they have bad moments and they have moments of heroism and they have moments of beauty and joy in their lives just as we do. And they're shaped by their environment just as we are.
Okay. I think maybe we should wrap up. So what I'll do is get the transcript. I'll put this on YouTube, this video, and get you as a private video, and then get you a link so you can look at it. And then I'll get a transcript put together by a service I use called Otter AI. And I might send you the raw transcript, but then it needs lots of editing. What I
Okay.
did before, so then I have to go through and watch the video again and so forth, or maybe rearrange things. So that'll take a bit of time.
Right. Do you have a length that you're aiming for the final production?
I don't know. I don't.
Okay.
I don't.
We'll see what happens. Okay.
I don't know. I think this has been a great conversation, and it's real interesting for me because I've heard a bit about what you've been up to, but not the details that we've talked about. And I think it sounds exciting. I think it's just sounds terrific.
Oh, well, thank you, John.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
And then maybe whatever in the future, if I can help with anything, surely.
Well,
Eager to.
I would love to talk about gardening and plant breeding and seeds if you decide that's something that might be of interest to your to the people viewing your site. That talking about the resiliency of our co-evolved plants, our domesticated plants and animals, that's an interesting discussion as well.
Okay, I have just for the past 3 days been reading Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. And
Right?
my mother recommended it to me 20 years ago and I never read it. And now it seems very relevant
Yeah.
with regard to climate change and so forth. And so just this morning, I was listening as I walked, listening to his account of how um, agriculture grew up in different parts of the world and the reasons that in some places people could create their own versions of plants in places they couldn't. And it's fascinating. It's all I mean, it's common sense once you know some of the details, but it's fascinating. So it's related to what you're talking about. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Jared Diamond is an interesting thinker, and he's not all. I don't think he's always correct in his presumptions and in the vehemence of his positions, but I do think interesting thinker, and he looks at the longer term, just as I hope to be, to that I do in my life, is looking at the longer term view of things. And you spoke about the time it takes for carbon to come out of the atmosphere, and that's actually one of the things I'm kind of exploring right now, because I'm thinking, okay, well, what plants do better with more opportunities and a slightly warmer, all chemical reactions happen more rapidly the warmer it is. You add a little bit of heat to a chemical reaction and it reacts faster. So, and I see the plant growth this year has been prodigious. And I don't know, I don't have any reference point really other than my experience to judge it by, but everybody else is saying the same thing. There are flowers in the forests that I've never seen before. 32 years of walking this trail and I've never seen that flower before. And this year there's tons of them in the forest. Now, where did those come from? He's like, those were latent seeds. Those were seeds that were latent in that soil for at least 30 years, and they've never come up before. So last year's prodigious rain, we had 46 inches of rain last year, in 2021, 46 inches on my porch.
wow.
Yeah. And so the normal for Deer Harbor is, in the mid 20s, 27, 25, that's more the average. And it's a little bit startling to have that much, but that water, a long, cool spring, and a plague of deer last year has changed things for plants. So there are things blooming all over the place that you've never seen. There's things are gargantuan sizes that normally are very small and stunted because they're already out of water by now. So it's an interesting, just seeing these changes, because they're not all bad changes. It's climate change. It's not climate crappiness, although it's mostly crappiness.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Especially for some people in some places.
Yeah. So if I can leave you with one thing,
sure.
In thinking about efficiency is the enemy of resiliency. And that we struggle for efficiency in our lives personally and culturally, and it makes us money if we can be more efficient. All of these things seem like a good, but there comes a point when efficiency becomes your enemy. And that's when you're struggling, when you're trying to build resiliency, and we need resiliency during a period of upheaval because we don't know what's coming.
Yeah.
That's what I'd leave you with.
I think that's really important. I understand it absolutely. And efficiency is monomaniacal, and nature is not efficient.
Precisely.
Nature keeps millions of options at hand all the time, and then there's a reason to express them. And so, and you're right. Efficiency is a way to run into a dead end and not be able to get out of it.
Precisely. So as an organism evolving over time, the more specialized something gets, the more efficient it might be, the more successful it might be in the short term, but it's building up to a crash.
Yeah,
And I fear that agriculture has allowed human beings to become more and more specialized, even though by nature we're generalists. So it's the people who are more highly specialized, I think, that are in a more fragile position. If you only know how to do one thing, you do it amazingly well, but you only know how to do one thing. It's like, if that thing is no longer needed or possible, you just made yourself superfluous.
yeah, that's a major theme of Wendell Berry's, the disappearance. What is it? The
Unsettling,
unsettling of America. That's a
right?
major theme. When I was in high school, our English teacher gave us a topic, a theme to write. Too much sanity is madness. And it's another way of thinking about efficiency versus
Okay.